Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the urinary system. The urinary system consists of the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And you remember the functions of the urinary system are excretion of waste, they filter the blood, and they're also pretty heavily involved in fluid and electrolyte balance and acid-base balance, and those are things we're going to talk about later this week. The kidneys lie against the posterior abdominal wall underneath the 12th rib. To describe their position, we use the word retroperitoneal, retro meaning behind, so it's posterior or behind the parietal peritoneum. They're underneath the 12th rib, so the ribs help to protect the kidneys. And then the kidneys also have a pretty good cushion of fat around them that helps to protect them. Each kidney is about 4 inches long. It's about 2 inches wide and about 1 inch thick. And they extend from the level of the T12 vertebrae, because remember it's underneath the 12th rib, to the L3 vertebrae. The right kidney is a little bit lower than the left because of the liver, which takes up the space above it. And then they're on the kidney, there's a thing called the hilum, H-I-L-U-M. It's a little slit. That's where all the blood vessels, the ureters, and the nerves enter and leave the kidney. It's a little concave notch on the medial side, so it would be right about here. Inside the kidney, first, around the outside, there's this really tough fibrous capsule, and then the inside consists of the renal cortex and the renal medulla. The cortex is this outer part, and then the medulla is this inner part. Extensions from the renal cortex called renal columns, and that's these things here. They look like columns, hence the name renal columns. They divide the interior into cone-shaped sections called renal pyramids, because they kind of look like a pyramid. If you look at this one here, it kind of looks like a pyramid. The base of each pyramid faces outward towards the cortex, and the point of the pyramid is called the renal papilla. That faces towards the hilum, and you can see here the hilum again, where all those blood vessels and nerves and everything go in and out. The papilla extends into a cup called a minor calyx. The minor calyx collects urine as it leaves the papilla, and 2 or 3 minor calyces join together to form a major calyx. The major calyces converge to form the renal pelvis, which takes the urine from the major calyces, and then the renal pelvis continues on as the ureter, which takes the urine to the urinary bladder. The renal artery, and that's this right here, and we call it artery because it's red in color. That's just the way it's depicted. That artery branches off the abdominal aorta. That's important to remember. That brings blood to the kidney, and as it enters the kidney, it then divides into smaller and smaller arteries. Those arteries pass through the renal columns and into the renal cortex. And then blood leaves the kidney through the renal vein, this right here, which empties into the inferior vena cava. And then when we look at the cardiac system, we'll learn the vena cava is what takes the blood back to the heart. Nephrons, the filtration units of the kidney, mostly lie in the outer region in the cortex. And you can see they have one boxed out right here. Our next slide is going to show a close-up of those. Most of it lies in the cortex, the outer region, but there is a loop of it, a section of it that is going to dip down into the medulla. So let's look at a nephron a little closer. The nephrons, like I said, they are the functional unit of the kidneys. That's where all the work of the kidneys happens. They need a constant flow of blood. More than 20% of the blood pumped by the heart each minute goes into the kidneys. So your kidneys are also very busy little organs. There's a series of afferent arterioles that come from the smaller arteries in the cortex. Each afferent arteriole supplies blood to one nephron. So that's this right here. This is bringing blood in. Each afferent arteriole branches into a cluster of capillaries called the glomerulus, and that's this right here. It's all coiled up and around and inside this little section here. And then blood leaves that glomerulus through an efferent arteriole, and that is this one right here. The efferent arteriole is a little smaller. So there's a higher pressure. I think we're going to talk about that next. There's a higher pressure inside here, and if you remember, filtration works by pressure. That's what pushes things out of the blood and into this network of tubes. You can see the efferent arteriole goes around here and then it wraps around all of these tubules. That's where filtration and reabsorption happens. Those are called the paratubular capillaries. These, like I said, these pick up water and solutes that are reabsorbed by the renal tubules and go back into the general bloodstream. The blood flow goes then from these paratubular capillaries into larger and larger veins that eventually feed into the renal vein. You can see as they go around here and down here, and now we're up here, and it goes back down into the vein. The renal corpuscle is the beginning of the nephron. The two main components of a nephron are the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The corpuscle is this part right here. It's all this whole part. It consists of the glomerulus that we just talked about, this little network of capillaries and arteries right here, and the Bowman's capsule, which is what surrounds that glomerulus. The Bowman's capsule consists of two layers of epithelial cells that surround the glomerulus in an open-ended covering. Think of it if you put your fist into an inflated balloon, your fist would represent the glomerulus. The balloon, which folds around your fist in two layers, you can kind of think of that as the Bowman's capsule. Fluid filters out of the glomerulus, collects in the space between the two layers of the Bowman's capsule. From there, it goes into the renal tubule on the other side of the capsule. The renal tubule is the other part of the nephron. It's this whole part right here, and there's, of course, different sections to it, because why would we make it easy? First, you have it's actually 4 different regions. The proximal convoluted tubule, which is right here. The nephron loop, this part here, this part here. The distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. So the proximal convoluted tubule, that's the very first part, and it's called proximal because it's closest to the Bowman's capsule. There are thousands of microvilli that allow absorption lining the inside of this proximal convoluted tubule. Then it straightens out. You can see it straightens out here a bit and dips down. This is where it dips down into the medulla before it turns back around and goes back up into the cortex. This whole section here, this descending part, the loop, and the ascending part, that's all called the loop of Henle. It's important to know when you start learning medications in cardiovascular, there's a diuretic that works on the loop of Henle. Once it gets back up here, this tubule, now we're back up into the cortex or the outer region of the kidney. This is called the distal convoluted tubule. It's convoluted because it's twisted, it bends, it turns, and it's distal because it's further away from the renal corpuscle or Bowman's capsule. Then it goes into the collecting duct here. The collecting duct really gets urine from many different nephrons. You can see all these little pieces here. These are actually coming from other nephrons. Then that collecting duct goes through the medulla, merges with other collecting ducts, and then drains into the minor calyx. Urine formation really involves 3 processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. We're going to look at each of these in a little more detail. Glomerular filtration, remember we said blood flows into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole. And I said it's larger than the efferent. You can, and this picture really depicts it very well. It's really larger than the efferent, the one that takes the blood back out. Because blood's flowing in faster than it can leave, there's a higher pressure in there, and that is what helps to filter out. Remember, filtration works on pressure. The walls of the glomerular capillaries, and I'm sorry, glomerular is a hard word for me to say. Those capillaries are dotted with pores, and water and small solutes like electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and some nitrogenous waste can filter out of the blood and into the Bowman's capsule. Blood cells, most plasma proteins are too large to pass through those pores, so they stay in there. If they're passing through, then that tells us there's something up with that capsule that are letting these larger cells, larger items through. The fluid then collects here in the Bowman's capsule and goes into the tubules from there. The amount of fluid filtered by both kidneys is a term we call the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. It equals about 180 liters each day. That's about 60 times your body's total blood volume. The body reabsorbs about 99% of this, which leaves about 1 or 2 liters to be excreted as urine. So GFR, you're going to see that on some lab reports when you get into the med-surg clinical. And it's not really an actual reading, it's more of a calculation. It should be constant, even despite changes in your blood pressure. And if the flow is too high, if there's too much filtering out, you're going to lose more water and nutrients. And if it's too low, those tubules are probably going to reabsorb some toxins. The other thing to talk about here is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is a key mechanism for maintaining blood pressure and by extension, a steady GFR. A decline in blood pressure leads to a decreased blood flow to the kidneys, and there's special cells in the afferent arterioles that respond by releasing the enzyme renin. So there's the first name, renin. Renin converts an inactive plasma protein called angiotensinogen that's made in the liver into angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 circulates to the lungs. So here we are, we're way down here already. Circulates to the lungs where the angiotensin converting enzyme converts it into angiotensin 2. So we got the angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone. And I know we learned with the endocrine system, aldosterone causes the distal convoluted tubule in the kidneys, in the glomerulus. So now we're back to here. Causes them to retain sodium. Water follows sodium, so that increased retention of water, your blood volume increases and your blood pressure rises. And then theoretically, everybody's happy. Okay, so we've talked about glomerular filtration, the first part of urine formation. The other two parts are tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. We're going to talk about those both together. After the filtrate leaves the glomerulus, it enters the tubules. Remember, we have the proximal convoluted, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted before it all passes into the collecting duct. Sodium moves by active transport out of the proximal convoluted tubule and into the bloodstream of the peritubular capillaries. So here's sodium along with the chloride. Water follows sodium, so there's the water following the sodium. Then glucose, amino acids, chloride, potassium, and bicarbonate also pass out of those tubules and into the blood. About half of urea, which is a nitrogenous waste, is also reabsorbed. At the same time, waste products like ammonia and uric acid, as well as some drugs like aspirin and penicillin, are secreted out of the blood and into the tubules. So the peritubular capillaries, these things are secreted into these tubules right in this area. The tubular secretion of hydrogen ions also occurs. That helps to regulate the body's pH. We're going to talk about that in a second. Water diffuses out in the descending limb of the loop of Henle, which further concentrates the filtrate. So this is getting even more concentrated. This urine that's being formed is even more concentrated right here because water is going back out and into the bloodstream. Sodium and chloride are actively pumped out when we get over to the other side, to the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, going into the interstitial fluid. The thicker wall, the ascending limb has a thicker wall that prevents water from following the sodium out of the tubules. So this is the one time when water does not follow sodium. Sodium and chloride are actively pumped out of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle into the interstitial fluid. I just said that. The distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts, and now we're up in here, reabsorb variable amounts of water and salt. There are specialized cells that play a role in acid-base balance, reabsorbing potassium and secreting hydrogen into the tubule. And there's several different hormones that help regulate the reabsorption by the cells in the distal convoluted tubule. The collecting duct reabsorbs water and concentrates the filtrate, resulting in urine. There's several hormones that affect the urinary system. We've talked about at least one of these. I think we've talked about them all at one point or another. The antidiuretic hormone right here causes the kidneys to reabsorb water and keep the water in the bloodstream instead of excreting it in the urine. Aldosterone, ANP, and PTH, they all act on the renal tubules. The ADH acts primarily on the collecting duct. The adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone when blood levels of sodium decline or when concentration of potassium increases. The atria of the heart are what secrete the ANP, the atrial natriuretic peptide. I have trouble with that word too. So that the name of it actually kind of tells you where that comes from. That's secreted when blood pressure rises, which inhibits the secretion of aldosterone and ADH. The posterior pituitary gland is what secretes the ADH, we learned that. And the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone in response to low calcium levels. We learned that with the endocrine system as well. Urine is made up mostly of water. In fact, about 95% of urine is water. Only about 5% of it is dissolved substances. These substances include things like urea, uric acid, ammonia, creatinine, and there's a few other solutes like sodium, potassium, and sulfate. A urinalysis can reveal a lot of information about the health of the kidneys and health of some other organs as well. Now, once your kidneys have made this urine, it travels down the ureter into the bladder. The bladder stores it until it can be eliminated. It is not, like, remember we learned the gallbladder stores and concentrates bile. The bladder just stores the urine. It does not concentrate it. It holds on to it. The ureters connect the renal pelvis of each kidney with the bladder. So the ureters come from the renal pelvis down to the bladder. The bladder itself, the wall of it is the detrusor muscle. That's D-E-T-R-U-S-O-R. It's 3 layers of smooth muscle because, again, why are we going to make things simple? Mucous transitional epithelium lines the bladder, and it's transitional so that it can stretch. As urine fills the bladder, the rugae, there's also rugae. Remember, we heard rugae somewhere else, I believe with the stomach. Rugae is folds that allow it to shrink, and then as it needs to expand, those rugae will flatten out, and the epithelium thins so the bladder can expand. The floor of the bladder has 3 openings, 2 from the ureters. They go behind the bladder to enter from below, and then 1 from the urethra. They form a triangular-shaped, smooth area on the floor of the bladder called the trigone. It's pictured right here. Here's the openings for each ureter, and then the opening for the urethra. So this part right here is called the trigone. This is usually where infections will start. Somebody gets a bladder infection or a UTI. At the point where the urethra leaves the bladder, there's a ring of smooth muscle that forms the internal urethral sphincter. So just like, remember with the digestive system, we had the internal anal sphincter and the external. You have the same thing with your bladder. This sphincter contracts involuntarily to retain urine in the bladder. So you really don't have you don't have any control over that one. There is a second sphincter right here. This is where the urethra passes through the pelvic floor. This is skeletal muscle, so therefore you can control it. And the urethra is really a little small tube that carries the urine away from the bladder out of the body. At the point where it opens to the outside of the body, we call that the external urinary meatus. In females, the urethra is about 3 centimeters long. That's about 1.2 inches, so it's not very long. It exits the body just in front of the vaginal orifice. In men, the urethra measures about 20 centimeters, which is about 7.9 inches, so it's quite a lot longer just because of the anatomy of men. It passes from the bladder through the center of the prostate gland. You can see this here, and we saw this with the reproductive system. Curves around the end of the penis and then exits the body at the tip of the penis, at the meatus. In men, the urethra conveys both urine and semen. We talked about that with the reproductive system. going to talk about is urination. Who knew this was such a complicated thing? When the bladder contains about 200 mLs or more of urine, stretch receptors in the bladder wall send impulses to the sacral region of the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends motor impulses to the bladder wall to contract and the internal sphincter to relax. And then voiding will occur unless the brain overrides that impulse. The brain can override the impulse because the stretch receptors in the bladder also send impulses to the micturition center in the pons. Remember the pons of the brain. The pons integrates that information with information from other parts of the brain, like the cerebrum, and decides whether the time is appropriate to urinate. If it's not appropriate, the brain sends impulses to stop urination and keep the external urinary sphincter contracted. If the time is appropriate, the brain signals the bladder wall to contract and the external urethral sphincter to relax, and then urination happens. So we've talked about the whole urinary system, the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, the urethra, the nephrons, which are the functional unit of the kidneys, and the filtration and the formation of urine. The filtration part is important because next we're going to be talking about fluid balance and acid-base balance, and then it's a big job of your kidneys to do that.